He was 25, a U.S. Marine back from deployment with nothing but debt-broken sleep and an eviction notice on the kitchen table. When he risked his last $50 on a dusty storage unit full of trash bags, no one expected anything but failure. Yet what he uncovered inside was more than valuable objects. It was a story of love loss and courage carried through generations. This is not a fairy tale, but it may change how you see chance itself. Like, subscribe, and tell us what you would have done. The furnace in the rented duplex coughed more than it breathed, leaving the rooms sharp with Ohio winter air. Ashbrook was quiet at 3:00 a.m. streetlights, throwing long, pale shadows across frost-streaked windows. Liam Reyes sat at the kitchen table in his fatigue's hair still cropped high and tight, though he hadn't stood inspection in over a year. On the table lay a paper that had already branded itself into his memory. Eviction notice, 30 days. He didn't read it again. The red ink still glared without help. From the phone speaker, his mother's voice came soft, apologetic, tired from another night at the rehab center. "Mijo, I can't send anything this week. I'm sorry. I'll try next paycheck." He pressed the phone flat on the counter, unable to answer thumb, working a coin until it burned warm. It was his deployment coin, scarred and dulled, the one thing he swore he would never pawn. The apartment smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cold plaster. He sipped from a chipped mug, let the bitterness sit heavy on his tongue. Outside, a plow dragged its metal throat down the street. Inside, silence crowded close. Liam stared at the eviction notice, then at the uniform jacket hanging on the back of the chair, perfect. Creases a relic of a man who once had a place, a purpose. At 4:30, he climbed into his truck, the engine groaning awake. The job today was another overnight shift at a warehouse security guard, minimum wage, half the hours promised. The steering wheel was stiff under his gloves, and the windshield wipers screeched over frozen glass. He drove past boarded storefronts and gas stations still lit like lonely lighthouses. That was when he saw it. A torn vinyl banner whipped in the wind outside a chain-link fence. "Storage auction today, 11 a.m. Treasure or trash?" The words looked ridiculous, carnival bright, against the gray morning. Liam laughed once, a dry sound. Treasure or trash, what was the difference anymore? He drove on, but his phone buzzed against the seat. A message from the security company shift canceled. Next pay delayed 2 weeks. He stared until the screen dimmed, pulse slow steady. No hours, no paycheck. The eviction notice marched closer in his head. At a red light, he saw the envelope he thought he'd thrown away, a payday loan flyer promising $500 instantly. He'd ripped it open weeks ago, cursed the 29.9% interest, and shoved it under the seat. Now it sat on the passenger cushion, accusing waiting. He hated debt more than hunger, but hunger didn't keep a roof. The light turned green. He drove past the exit he should have taken, then circled back. His jaw tightened as he turned into the cracked lot of the storage facility. The banner above him slapped again in the wind. Treasure or trash? He parked between two trucks already waiting for the morning's auction. His breath clouded the cab. He held the coin once more, rubbed it until it felt like a small sun in his palm. For the first time in months, he felt the whisper of a plan. Riverbend Secure Storage sat at the edge of the river town, its rows of corrugated steel doors rattling in the winter wind like teeth. By the time Liam arrived, the lot was already crowded, pickups and vans, idling men and women stamping their boots against the cold. He parked between a dented Chevy and a rental van plastered with the logo of a resale shop. When he stepped out, the cold caught his breath sharp enough to sting his lungs. He stood tall in his pressed uniform jacket boots, polished, as if he were still reporting for duty. The others noticed. Heads turned briefly before dismissing him, veterans of a different kind of battlefield. These were the scavengers of storage auctions, men with tape measures hooked to their belts, women clutching tablets to scan resale values, couples with eager eyes that glittered at the thought of a bargain. They laughed together, a pack of crows waiting to descend. Liam registered inside with Hank, the manager, a heavy-set man with a cap pulled low and eyes that had seen too many desperate bids. "25 registration," Hank said without looking up. Liam handed over his debit card and signed his name in clean block letters, Reyes L. Hank glanced at the polished boots, the squared shoulders, and raised his eyebrows as if to say, "You don't belong here." He handed Liam a paddle with the number 42 scrawled in marker. The auction began briskly. Doors groaned upward one after another, each revealing a different fragment of a life, boxed and abandoned. Unit A3 held a dining set, glossy cherry wood, a sofa with floral upholstery. Bidding shot past 800 in minutes, two men raising paddles like fencers testing reach. Unit B11 had exercise equipment barely scuffed a treadmill, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. 400? 500. Sold at 650 to a woman in a down vest who knew exactly how many buyers waited online for discounted gym gear. Liam stood silent, hands steady at his sides, eyes narrowing slightly with every reveal. He felt as he had once on patrol down a hostile street, watching cataloging measuring patterns invisible to the casual passerby. Where others saw furniture or rusted tools, he saw the ways people left traces of themselves and how things were arranged in the quiet discipline or carelessness behind each stack. By the time the crowd reached Unit C19, laughter had softened into impatience. Hank tugged the steel door, and it rose with a screech, revealing darkness broken only by the glint of torn plastic. Dozens of heavy black bags filled the space floor to ceiling, stacked into an uneven wall. A sour smell drifted out, not sharp, but stale. The smell of time sealed too long. Someone snorted. "Eviction cleanup," a man muttered. Another pinched his nose theatrically. "Smells like trash." A ripple of derision moved through the crowd. No one leaned in. No one raised a paddle. The consensus was instant worthless. But Liam did not step back. He studied the bags with the same focus he once used to scan doorways for tripwires. They were not flimsy grocery sacks. These were industrial contractor bags tied with square knots stacked flush to the wall. No sloppy bulges, no gaps. Whoever packed this unit had done it with intention. His gaze dropped to the concrete floor just inside the threshold, where a slip of paper curled near his boot. He crouched, careful not to cross the line, and squinted at faded ink, Langford dry cleaning receipt, dated 7 years past. A detail, a clue, something the others had dismissed without seeing. He straightened, inhaled, and caught it. Then the faint sweetness of cedar, the same scent used to preserve garments in closets to keep moths at bay. Not the stench of refuse, but the memory of careful preservation. Hank raised his voice through the cold air. Opening bid $25. Silence. Paddles hung low. The crowd shuffled, eager to move on. Liam's heartbeat was steady, his breath controlled. He lifted his paddle voice even. 25. A few heads turned surprised. A chuckle rippled. Hank's eyebrows lifted, but he nodded. 25. Do I hear 50? Silence stretched, brittle as ice. Liam felt the coin in his pocket, its edges pressing into his palm, and for a moment he imagined Robert Langford, or whoever the name belonged to, tying each knot, stacking each bag with the same discipline he had once used to pack gear. He lifted his chin. 50. The crowd exchanged looks, smirks bending at the corners of mouths. To them it was foolishness money thrown into a pit. Hank hesitated, gavel raised, but eyes measuring the Marine's face. 50 sold to Reyes. The wooden hammer came down with a flat crack. Liam counted out $50 in cash for the unit price, while the registration charge ran on his card. There was no applause, only muttered amusement, and one woman whispering to her husband, "Poor guy must be new." Liam lowered his paddle, expression unchanged. He felt none of their laughter, none of their pity. He felt only the whisper of cedar, and the weight of a decision made the kind that split a life into before and after. He stepped back from the doorway, the number 42 still in his hand, the unit C19 now his, the dark wall of bags watching silently as the crowd moved on to the next door. Hank allowed a preliminary inventory, with the door half lowered, while payment processing finished. The crowd drifted down the row of units, hungry for the next easy prize, leaving Liam alone before the dark mouth of C19. Hank allowed a preliminary inventory with the door half lowered while payment processing finished. He let the steel door down to half its height, shutting out their laughter, the whistles, the easy bargains shouted from further down. Silence gathered in the narrow corridor, broken only by the winter wind scraping across sheet metal. He slipped on a pair of gloves, pulled a utility knife from his pocket, and crouched before the nearest black bag. The blade whispered through thick plastic, and the bag sagged open. He braced for rot, for mildew, for the sour stench that justified the crowd's scorn. Instead, the air filled with a faint perfume of cedar and wool. He reached inside and drew out a jacket women's silk lined, the label stitched with gold thread from a boutique he recognized by name. Clean-pressed, unworn, his breath slowed. He set it aside and reached deeper, pulling free another garment, fine cashmere, with a thrift store tag affixed clumsily over its original price. The contradiction pressed against him, once treasured, then discarded, then purchased again, the cycle of a life folded into seams. He set the garments gently on the tarp he had spread and moved to the next bag. The knife cut again steady. Inside were shoeboxes stacked neatly, each pair wrapped in tissue. Pumps, flats, elegant heels, all the same size, all preserved as if the owner had intended to wear them again but never did. Some still carried boutique receipts tucked inside their lids, dates fading but legible. He touched the paper, felt the crinkle of the years, and thought of things left behind not by neglect, but by necessity. Another bag yielded leather purses, the kind he had seen only in glass cases at department stores when his mother walked past, shaking her head at the prices. Caraway leather ash and Adler. He examined the stitching, the weight of the clasps, the engraved serial numbers on tiny tags hidden in the lining. His training had taught him to distinguish counterfeit from authentic in foreign markets where fakes flooded stalls. The precision here told him these were real. His pulse quickened as he realized the value, but what struck deeper was the care. These items had been chosen, purchased with discernment, then packed with intention. He shifted another layer of clothing, and a photograph slipped free, caught at the edge of a sleeve. He picked it up, the edges soft with age. A woman's silver hair, swept back pearls at her neck, stood beside a man he recognized from campaign posters years ago, a former governor smiling at some gala. She wore grace-like armor, eyes alive with practiced confidence. On the back, in neat cursive, the words Langford Foundation Charity Event. The ink had bled slightly, but the name carried weight. Liam turned it over again, studying the details, the posture of a woman who belonged, who had built her presence carefully in circles he had never touched. He placed it carefully atop the clothing, as if setting it back into memory. In another bag, he found a tailored suit, immaculate fabric, with a discreet label from a high-end store in Columbus. Over it clung a thrift tag, like an afterthought, as though its worth had been repackaged, reduced, then reclaimed. It unsettled him, the image of garments moving from wealth to charity rack and back again, worn perhaps once more, then returned. A cycle of acquisition and release, as if value was less about fabric and more about the story attached. He pressed the fabric between his fingers, thinking of the promises stitched into uniforms, the way cloth could carry entire lives. At the far corner of the unit, beneath a stack of heavier bags, he noticed a sliver of cardboard. He dragged one free and opened it to reveal not clothes, but a bundle of index cards bound with a rubber band browned by time. He slid one free. The name was typed at the top in clean font, Beatrice A. Langford. Below, in neat handwriting, were seating arrangements, tables, mapped lists of donors and dignitaries. Each card bore the same deliberate hand-ordered disciplined. He thumbed through them, hearing in the silence the murmur of crowded halls, the clink of glasses, the applause of evenings designed with precision. These were not belongings discarded in haste. They were archives of a life coded in names and arrangements, a woman's professional map of influence. The air inside the unit felt different now, less like stale confinement, more like a chamber where stories had been sealed. Liam stood among the opened bags, surrounded by garments, shoes, purses, The photograph propped against a folded jacket, the stack of index cards resting in his gloved hand. Outside, a truck engine rumbled, a door slammed, and the voices of bidders carried faintly, but here the silence was white, dense, protective. He realized he was trespassing not into trash, but into memory, each bag a chapter, each knot tied with care, by hands that understood the weight of preservation. He looked at the half-open door at the corridor beyond, and then back at the cedar-scented dark, the neatness of it all pulling him deeper. The air in the unit had thickened into something that felt less like dust, and more like the gravity of a secret pulling Liam deeper as he moved the bags aside. He reached for one that sagged heavily against the corner, dragging it onto the tarp. The seams groaned as he cut across the knife, slicing through layers of tape until the opening yawned. Inside, wrapped in an old scarf, was a cedar box, the kind he had seen officers use overseas to store cigars against the damp. Tape sealed its lid in 2 uneven bands. He peeled it away and lifted the top, bracing for the smell of tobacco. But what lay within was different brooches, glittering dully in the weak light. A tangle of silver chains, rings with stones, clouded but heavy, and resting in a velvet pouch, a string of pearls. He cupped them in his gloved hand, the weight unmistakable. These were not glass. The pearls varied slightly in shape luster, shifting softly with each tilt, nacre deep and uneven like the surface of water at dawn. Real, he thought, the word rising like a breath he had been holding too long. He swallowed the moment heavy, aware that something valuable had been locked away here, not discarded. Beneath the cedar box, pressed flat under a sheaf of plastic, was a folder of papers, corners yellowed, still bound with brass clasps. Liam pulled it free, setting aside the jewelry, and spread the pages across his knee. Contracts for event planning signatures in neat ink outlines of galas and charity dinners. Donation lists ran in columns, names of people he recognized from news articles and campaign mailers. There were receipts, checks, scanned notes in the margin about table arrangements and speech times. It was meticulous work, each page testifying that Beatrice Langford had not only lived among wealth, but shaped it. Organized, it guided it like a conductor through evenings of influence. He turned the papers, the edges whispering, and felt as though he was unfolding a map of a life where every path led toward service and recognition. Another bag tore open to reveal an unexpected brightness, ornaments wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue, each one cushioned as though a fragile relic. Glass spheres hand-painted with winter scenes, crystal snowflakes bearing the maker's mark of Waterford figurines of porcelain angels with gold leaf halos. He unwrapped one, turning it over in his palm, and remembered barracks at Christmas, overseas, a plastic tree strung with cheap lights, the ache of homesickness in every laugh. Here was something entirely different, luxury meant to bring elegance to a holiday beauty layered on tradition. He set it gently aside, surprised by the care that had gone into wrapping each one, as if Beatrice had known someone might one day unwrap them with reverence. He moved to another purse, less impressive. At first glance, its leather cracked and worn. He almost set it aside, but checked the interior, fingers brushing against a hidden pocket. There, tucked between seams, was a small brass key, heavy for its size. He held it up to the light. Stamped along its side, River City Bank Box, 312. His pulse quickened. A safe deposit box meant something more than ornaments or receipts. It meant a cache, something someone had wanted, kept secure beyond reach of chance. He closed his hand around the key, the edges biting against his palm, the implications too large to ignore. In another bag, he found more purses, each with its own quiet story, but one in particular caught his attention. A modest handbag, not of the same pedigree as the others, its lining frayed. He ran his fingers along the seam and felt paper stitched within. Carefully, he teased it free, unfolding a pawn ticket browned with age. Written across the top was Beatrice's full name, but the handwriting below was different. Hurried, rougher Joe Caretaker. The ink had smudged, but the message was clear enough. Someone else had held her belongings at some point. Someone who signed themselves as Joe, someone entrusted, or perhaps someone who had taken advantage. The note clung to him like a shadow, a thread pulling toward another unseen chapter. He sat back on his heels, surrounded by the weight of discovery. Jewelry hidden in cigar boxes, contracts mapping entire nights of influence, holiday ornaments swaddled like heirlooms, a safe deposit key that whispered of secrets locked in vaults, and a pawn slip signed by an unknown hand. Around him, the air felt charged, as if the unit itself knew he had stumbled onto something deeper than resale, deeper than luck. He ran a hand over his cropped hair, felt the coin press against his thigh, and realized he was not simply sorting through bags of forgotten belongings. He was piecing together a trail, each object another marker, each note another clue pointing beyond the steel walls of Riverbend Secure Storage. The silence around him pressed close, waiting as if the bags still unopened were holding their breath for what he might uncover next. Liam carried the discovery home like a soldier guarding classified documents, careful, almost reverent. He photographed a handful of items under the weak light of his kitchen lamp: a caraway purse, a tailored jacket, the string of pearls laid across dark cloth, and posted them online with cautious descriptions. He did not overstate, did not dare to write luxury or rare, only listed what he saw, what he knew. For a moment, the numbers on the screen gave him a fragile sense of control, the illusion of progress. He slept that night in the living room, Boots still near the door phone, close on the table. At dawn, the phone's vibration pulled him awake. His account had been suspended, flagged for possible counterfeit goods. The words cut deeper than he expected. Authenticity, questioned funds frozen. The coffee he poured tasted like ash in his mouth, his chest hollow with a panic that spread like frost. He thought of the key from River City Bank, the pawn ticket with the name Joe, the careful handwriting on index cards. These things were real, he knew it in his bones, yet the marketplace reduced them to suspicion, treating his word as worthless. He pressed his thumb into the coin in his pocket hard enough to leave an imprint. He did not curse. He called Dre. Dre answered on the second ring, voice low from sleep, but when Liam asked for help, there was no hesitation. An hour later, Dre arrived at the duplex with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a camera bag in the other. They did not talk much. Dre handed over the coffee first, a gesture of quiet loyalty, then unpacked the camera and tripod. He had been with Liam in sand and dust through patrols where silence was survival, and now he brought the same presence here, in a kitchen that smelled of burnt toast and worry. Together they drove back to Riverbend Secure Storage. The January wind rattled the steel doors as they pulled up. C-19 waited unchanged, but Liam felt a different weight stepping inside with a witness. Dre lifted the camera, adjusted the lens, and began capturing the objects with precision angles, lighting every mark that could verify authenticity. Liam continued to dig through the bags, cataloging quietly, pulling garments onto tarps in organized rows. The cedar scent lingered faintly, but with it came another odor, sharper, invasive. He dragged forward a heavy bag, one that sagged more than the others. The plastic split before he could cut it fully. A wave of mildew rolled out, damp and sour, choking the air. Inside garments, stuck together, leather purses bubbled with mold fabric rotted into lace of decay. He coughed, stepping back, heart sinking. Nearly a third of the contents showed water damage. Shoes warped, stitching dissolved, delicate silk fused into brittle clumps. What had been preserved elsewhere had here been undone by moisture neglect time. He set the ruined items aside, each one a reminder that not everything could be salvaged. The hope he had felt began to fray. Dre lowered the camera. "That's a loss," he said softly, as if stating a battlefield casualty. Liam nodded, throat tight. The pile of ruined belongings looked like fallen soldiers, each carrying the memory of a life, but stripped of value, stripped of purpose. He forced himself to keep working, separating what could be saved from what was beyond rescue. The air was heavy with mold, his gloves slick from damp fabric, the cold corridor no longer enough to cleanse it. He was bent over another bag when Hank's shadow stretched across the unit. The manager leaned against the doorframe clipboard, in handcap pulled low. "Reyes," he said, voice flat. Liam stood wiping his gloves against his jacket instinctively, though nothing would remove the damp smell clinging to him. Hank cleared his throat. "Your card bounced. Registration fee didn't clear. Company policy says unpaid balance doubles if not settled by now." Hank added that the clean-out deposit would remain on hold until the registration charge cleared. His eyes flicked over the tarps, the opened bags, the careful rows Liam had made. "So you owe 50 more." The words landed with the same cold finality as the suspension notice that morning. Liam felt the walls press closer, options narrowing. He reached for his wallet, but he already knew what he would find. Emptiness cards near their limit cash gone. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Dre stepped forward, pulling out his own card. "Put it on me," he said simply. Hank swiped without comment, tore a receipt, and left. The door rattled as it shut behind him, leaving only the two Marines in the half-light. Liam's chest tightened with something heavier than defeat. He wanted to refuse to insist on carrying his own burden, but the words stuck. Dre set a hand briefly on his shoulder, a weight steadying rather than pitying, then returned to the camera. Liam swallowed hard, nodded once, and bent back to the work. The ruined clothes still lay between them, their smell sharp, their message clear. Survival was not guaranteed, not for fabric, not for memories, not even for men who once believed themselves unbreakable. The silence returned, thick as before. But beneath it pulsed a rhythm he recognized, the sound of persistence, of men who understood that even when things fell apart, the work had to continue. The mildew smell still clung to Liam's gloves as he pulled another box forward from the shadows of C-19. It was lighter than the rest, wrapped in linen embroidered with 3 careful letters, BAL. He unfolded the cloth, smoothing it across his knee, and inside found a small, leather-bound book. Its spine cracked softly as he opened it. The first page bore handwriting, steady and deliberate. "If I forget, let these pages remember for me." He read the words twice, the ink dark and certain, the tone carrying both dignity and a quiet plea. As he turned the pages, the handwriting changed, the lines wobbling slightly, letters drifting, as though the hand had grown tired, or the mind less sure of its path. Each entry was a fragment of thought, a memory of a dinner hosted, a name of a guest seated near the dais, a fleeting note about forgetting where the pearls had been placed. It was not simply a journal. It was a lifeline tied to memory, a battle against the erosion of identity. Tucked into the center of the book was a folded sheaf of paper, brittle at the edges. He opened it carefully and found a codicil, a copy of an amendment to a will. It named specific items to be donated to the Whitford Museum of Civic History garments, jewelry papers of significance. The signature line was empty, no seal, no witness. Only intention preserved without the weight of law. Liam stared at it, imagining the woman Beatrice Langford poised with pen, but interrupted or perhaps overtaken by doubt or failing strength. The document carried the shape of her wishes, but lacked the power to enforce them. Further along in the book, another slip of paper rested like a pressed leaf. A Christmas card, its front embossed with holly. Inside, a neat script in a man's hand to Beatrice, my steadfast, Richard. It was signed Colonel Richard Langford Rhett, a name followed by a date 2 years past. Liam felt the formality of the words, the pride in the title, the devotion folded into them. He could picture the man straight-backed, even in age, offering love in the cadence of command. The card smelled faintly of cedar, as if it had been kept with the same care as the garments. As he read further, the journal faltered. The lines were less legible ink, smeared in places where the hand had trembled. The last pages were not paragraphs, but broken thoughts. Remember Richard's medals. Safe place. Not safe enough. The scrawl was urgent, uneven, as if she had fought the weight of forgetfulness, leaving only breadcrumbs for herself or whoever would come after. Liam's throat tightened as he ran his finger under the words, the desperation evident in every stroke. This was not simply an inventory of a life. It was the voice of someone trying to anchor memory before it drifted too far. He set the journal aside and noticed a worn Bible among the stacked boxes. Its cover was cracked with age pages yellowed. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight disproportionate to its size. When he opened it, the middle section was hollowed out with meticulous cuts, leaving a cavity within. Nestled inside was a small velvet box, dark green edges worn smooth. His breath caught as he lifted it free. Opening it slowly, he revealed a pendant, sapphire, deep, as night encircled with small diamonds that winked faintly in the dim light. The stone seemed to draw in what little brightness remained, holding it captive. Folded beneath the pendant was a slip of paper, a man's handwriting again. For B, for every homecoming. The words were both promise and prayer. Liam closed his hand over the box, feeling the weight of devotion that had once hung from a chain around Beatrice's neck. He turned back to the Bible, slipping one of the loose pages at the back free. Scrawled across it in thick, hurried strokes were 3 words, "Do not lose." The ink was darker, fresher than the rest, as though written closer to the end, a final command scratched out when clarity broke through the fog. Liam stared at it, heart heavy. He thought of the medals hidden, the pendant preserved, the journal filled with battles against time. He thought of Beatrice's world built with elegance and influence, now sealed in plastic bags and dust, and of Richard's steady devotion, his words still alive in cards and notes. These objects were no longer belongings. They were ghosts with addresses, stories waiting for someone to carry them forward. The air of the unit pressed closer, heavy with the weight of memory, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for him to choose what to do with what he had found. He held the velvet case before him, the pendant inside carrying the weight of 2 lives interwoven. He knew the objects in his care were more than potential profit. They were fragments of a history at risk of vanishing into dust. That night he composed an email to the Whitford Museum of Civic History, attaching photographs of the index cards, the contracts. The pendant, the carefully preserved clothing. His words were measured respectful, explaining that the items came from an auction lot, but bore significance that should not be ignored. By morning, the museum replied, expressing immediate interest and asking him to bring the collection for authentication. Before heading home, he stopped at River City Bank and learned that Safe Deposit Box 312 had been closed for non-payment several years earlier, and its contents disposed of according to policy. The key he held was a relic of intent rather than a path to anything recoverable. The words gave him both relief and responsibility, for once he felt that perhaps he was not simply a man rummaging through discarded bags, but someone trusted to safeguard memory. Before taking the items to the museum, Liam followed another lead left in the journal. He drove across town to Guardian Pines, the care home named in Beatrice's notes. The building stood low and quiet against the winter sky, its bricks softened by years of weather. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of disinfectant and oatmeal. At the front desk, a nurse in blue scrubs looked up with a kind but weary smile. He asked about Beatrice Langford, voice steady, though his chest tightened. The nurse lowered her tone and said gently, "She's still with us. Some days she remembers everything. Some days she fades. It depends." Liam felt the words strike deeper than expected. He asked if he could see her, but when he reached the doorway of her room, his steps faltered. Through the half-open door, he saw her sitting in a chair by the window, silver hair combed neatly cardigan, folded around thin shoulders. Her hands were folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the bare trees outside. He gripped the doorframe but did not enter. Something held him back, a sense that he was an intruder carrying her past in his bag. He turned quietly, leaving before she could turn to see him. Back at Riverbend, Liam pulled open the door of C-19, the bags still stacked like silent witnesses. The familiar cold of the steel corridor wrapped around him as he stepped inside, intending to continue the careful cataloging. He was not alone. A man stood in the narrow aisle, tall, dressed in an expensive gray suit that seemed out of place among rust and dust. His features were sharp, his expression taut, and his eyes fixed on Liam with restrained hostility. The man spoke, first voice controlled, but edged with impatience. "I'm Graham Langford. This was my mother's unit." The words fell heavy, charged with ownership, with authority that expected obedience. Liam held his ground, though his pulse tightened. He explained calmly that the unit had been auctioned legally, that he had bid and paid, that the items were now his responsibility. Graham shook his head sharply, a practiced gesture of dismissal. He insisted that the fees had been covered, that some error in the company's system had allowed the sale. "This should never have left our family," he said, voice rising slightly. Hank appeared then, drawn by the voices. The manager adjusted his cap, arms crossed, and replied flatly, "Auction's final. Once the door opens, there's no going back. Law is law." His words carried no judgment, only procedure. Graham's mouth tightened, his jaw flexing, but he did not argue with Hank. Instead, he turned his focus back to Liam. "I don't care about the clothes," Graham said quickly, "or the old papers. I need to know if certain items are still here. A brooch from the Nixon reception, a compact given at the Reagan dinner, a set of cufflinks presented at the State Library Gala." He listed them like inventory numbers, his tone urgent but not sentimental. It was not family photographs or handwritten notes he asked after, but specific artifacts known to carry monetary and historical value. Liam studied him, reading the impatience in his stance, the cold calculation behind the questions. Graham did not ask about his mother's journal, did not mention her trembling handwriting, did not seem to know or care about the pendant hidden in the Bible. To him, the unit was not a grave of memory, but a ledger waiting to be balanced. Liam did not answer. He let the silence stand, the sound of wind slipping through the steel corridors, filling the space between them. Graham's eyes narrowed, measuring him, and for a long moment, neither man moved, the air thick with the weight of something unspoken. The Whitford Museum received Liam with professional courtesy, the glass doors opening to a space filled with quiet reverence and the scent of polished wood. He placed the leather folder on the conference table and spread out the documents carefully. The curators leaned in, their white-gloved hands, lifting invitations, event programs, and index cards. One of them, an archivist with silver hair pulled into a bun, adjusted her glasses, and whispered that several of the gala programs were authentic artifacts worth preserving for the historical record. They spoke of their importance in understanding social networks, fundraising circles, and the cultural imprint of donors like the Langfords. Yet when Liam asked about valuation, the tone shifted. They explained gently that museums do not purchase such materials, they accept them as donations. They would issue a formal acknowledgement letter, which could serve as a tax deduction, but no money would change hands. Liam nodded, but inside he felt the ground shift, the hope of financial rescue colliding with the reality of nonprofit procedures. Later in the museum's staff office, another twist came. A junior researcher entered with a file and spoke quietly to the archivist before setting a single photograph on the table. The image bore Beatrice's elegant script on the back, yet under magnification the ink appeared uniform, machine-generated, rather than handwritten. The archivist explained it was a forgery, perhaps introduced later among authentic materials, perhaps by someone in the family attempting to enhance the perceived value. Liam felt his chest tighten. If one piece could be questioned, the shadow might fall on the whole lot. Yet after careful review, the other documents were declared genuine. The forgery was an anomaly, not the rule. As he left the museum, the winter air cut against his face. He had preserved something of value, but no funds had changed hands, no relief arrived. That evening, he received a message through an acquaintance of Dre's. A private collector, wealthy and discreet, had seen images of the pendant and the event programs. The offer was direct, a substantial sum in cash, no questions asked, immediate exchange. Liam sat in the dark of his kitchen, the number glowing on his phone screen, a number high enough to clear debts, pay rent, and buy months of stability. Yet the words of Beatrice's journal whispered at the edges of his mind. These treasures remain. I hope whoever finds them will see beyond their market value. The weight of choice settled heavily on his shoulders. Drawn back to Guardian Pines, Liam carried only the pendant in its velvet case. The halls were hushed television murmurs blending with the rhythm of footsteps on linoleum. When he reached her room, the door was ajar. Beatrice sat as before, cardigan folded, gaze unfocused toward the window. For a moment, she did not stir. Then she turned, and her eyes caught the sight of his uniform. Her posture straightened, and her voice rang with surprising clarity. "Marine," she said firmly, like a command across time. Liam stood straighter, throat tight, and replied instinctively, "Present, ma'am." She smiled faintly, a trace of recognition flickering across her lined face. For a moment, the veil of confusion lifted, and in her eyes he saw both the woman of the photographs and the fragility of the present. He did not open the case, but he felt its presence like a heartbeat in his hand. The following week, tension thickened. Graham Langford appeared at the Whitford Museum, flanked by a lawyer in a dark suit. Their voices carried authority, demanding that all items be returned to the family estate. The lawyer spoke of inheritance rights, of family property mishandled, of reputational harm. The curators remained calm but firm, pointing to the auction contract, the transfer of legal ownership, the clear precedent of property law. Graham pressed harder, his voice echoing in the quiet gallery halls. He did not mention Beatrice's journal or her wishes, only the marketable pieces, the Nixon brooch, the Reagan compact, the pendant rumored among collectors. Liam stood nearby, silent, watching the exchange unfold. His name was mentioned as the buyer, his role acknowledged but not respected. To Graham, he was a placeholder between family wealth and its retrieval. The lawyer's threat of litigation hung in the air like smoke. The museum director, dignified but weary, responded with precision. "The law of auction is final. Your mother's possessions were surrendered legally. Unless fraud in the auction process can be proven, they do not revert." Graham's face darkened, his jaw set, but he did not press further in that moment. Instead, he turned his gaze on Liam, studying him with quiet intensity, as though weighing whether this Marine was an obstacle or an asset. The silence between them stretched, carrying more weight than any shouted accusation. Liam's decision came with the heavy certainty of a man who had once lived by codes etched into bone. He would not barter with all that he had found. The medals, the letters, the photographs, the journal, the sapphire pendant hidden so carefully within Richard's Bible, these belonged to the family, to memory, to dignity. The museum could receive the invitations and event programs as they represented history beyond a single household. The clothing, the handbags, the shoes, those could be his lifeline items he could sell without betraying the essence of what he had uncovered. He returned to his small apartment with a sense of direction, though the bills on the counter whispered of consequences waiting. The online platform reinstated his account after 2 weeks of appeals, yet trust was fractured. Buyers were quick to demand returns, to claim unpleasant odors, to dispute authenticity, despite his careful photographs and descriptions. He battled through emails and insurance claims, spending long nights with forms and policies, his chest tight as overdue notices piled. 3 weeks vanished into arguments with shipping companies, into phone calls that left him drained into silence, broken only by the hum of a refrigerator that seemed louder with each unpaid electric bill. One morning, a notice taped to his door warned of service disconnection. He tore it down with steady hands, but the edges cut into his palm. At Guardian Pines, the sterile light softened when Elise entered. She was Beatrice's daughter, her resemblance undeniable, though marked by exhaustion, her eyes red-rimmed from years of tension. When Liam placed the journal in her hands, she traced the first page with trembling fingers. Tears welled, and her voice cracked as she whispered that her mother had written everything down so she would not forget, so memory could be preserved when her mind betrayed her. Liam stood by in silence, the pendant in his pocket, listening to grief take shape. In a moment of vulnerable honesty, Elise revealed what suspicion had long gnawed at her. She spoke of Joe, the caretaker, hired during the last years before Guardian Pines, a woman with kind manners but shadowed motives. Elise admitted that she had once listened to an old voicemail in which her mother's voice broke, disoriented, yet insistent, accusing Joe of taking things, pawning what had been entrusted. The message was fragmented, confused, yet the intention was clear enough to plant doubt. Elise's words trembled with guilt. She had not acted. Then she had dismissed it as confusion, and now she feared too much had been lost because of that choice. Liam absorbed it silently, picturing the pawn slip he had found, the name Joe scribbled across it like a trace of betrayal. When Graham arrived later that week, tension thickened like storm clouds. Elise tried to show him the handwritten draft of a new will discovered pressed within embroidered linens. Beatrice had expressed her wish to leave certain possessions to the museum, others to Elise, dividing with purpose rather than equal halves. Graham's face hardened as he scanned the paper, then tossed it back onto the table with dismissal. "It's nothing," he said flatly. "A draft. Not notarized, not witnessed. Just paper." Elise's protest faltered under the weight of his certainty. Liam watched the exchange with quiet unease, aware of the gulf between legal standing and moral intent. Meanwhile, his own struggles grew sharper. Online sales limped forward, but profits dissolved under disputes. He ate sparingly, stretching rice and canned beans, while his body carried the stiffness of both exhaustion and old wounds. Dre checked in often, bringing coffee, leaving without comment, when Liam's pride made conversation short. The Marine's discipline kept him upright, but shadows lingered under his eyes, and his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror looked less like a soldier and more like a man cornered. At night, he read again through the journal pages, through Richard's steady script in letters, through Beatrice's careful handwriting that grew shaky over time. He recognized something he had felt in the desert, the fear of losing pieces of oneself, not to bullets, but to silence. The sapphire pendant glimmered faintly when the light caught it, a reminder that love had once been carved into every choice these people made. He thought of Elise, crying over her mother's words of Graham's indifference, of Beatrice calling him Marine, with a clarity that pierced dementia. In those moments, the weight of guardianship pressed on him heavier than any financial burden. Each day brought a choice between survival and honor, between selling what was easiest and protecting what was sacred. He walked that line like a man crossing a narrow ridge, aware that a misstep in either direction could undo everything. The museum called again, requesting additional context for the donated items. Collectors pressed harder with new offers, their figures rising as whispers of what he possessed spread through unseen networks. Graham's lawyer sent a letter threatening formal action. Elise left messages full of apology and gratitude, and Guardian Pines called once to say that Beatrice had been lucid for a few minutes, asking about her husband's medals. Liam listened, unable to answer, the pendant warm in his palm, as though urging him toward a path he had not yet chosen. Liam pressed the uniform's sharp crease one final time before slipping into his marine dress blues that still carried the weight of ceremonies past. At Guardian Pines, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers, but when Beatrice turned her head toward him, her gaze held a startling lucidity. Her eyes shimmered like polished stones as she whispered, "Did we win?" Her voice was frail, but carried the dignity of a woman who had once commanded ballrooms and boardrooms. Liam knelt beside her bed, steadying his breath. "Some days we win, some days we lose," he said softly. "But we keep each other. That is the victory." She reached out, trembling hand brushing the marine stripe on his sleeve. From his pocket he drew the small velvet box, opening it so that the sapphire pendant caught the sterile light and refracted it into something gentler. Beatrice inhaled sharply, her lips shaping one word, Richard. Home. Then, with a fading strength, she added, "Take it where the story will remain." Liam bowed his head, the sense of mission clearer than any order he had received in uniform. The Whitford Museum agreed to accept the pendant on loan pending authentication, and later accessioned it as a permanent piece. They arranged a modest ceremony in a wood-paneled hall filled with portraits of history's guardians. The sapphire lay within a glass case, the inscription card bearing Beatrice's name alongside Richard's service. Elise stood with tears streaming as she clasped Liam's hand, thanking him for protecting what her mother had feared would be forgotten. Graham stood nearby in silence, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy with unspoken reckonings. For Liam, the applause and polite speeches were distant echoes compared to the simple relief in Beatrice's eyes when she entrusted him. The ceremony ended with a curator's quiet words. "Some treasures are measured not in dollars, but in what they carry forward." Meanwhile, survival demanded its own relentless accounting. His online store flickered alive, the platform restored, and at last a private collector approached again. This time the offer was higher, calculated, insistent. Liam weighed the choices in long nights of silence before accepting. Nearly all of the handbags, coats, and ornaments changed hands for a sum that covered months of living expenses. He kept back a few pieces: deliberately sturdy shoes, a carved wooden jewelry box, a leather satchel enough to seed the business he envisioned. He named it Second Light Goods, a nod to both what he had received and what he hoped to pass on. 8 days before the eviction deadline, he walked into the leasing office and placed a cashier's check on the counter. The clerk's surprise was plain, but Liam only asked for a receipt and left with quiet dignity. His relief came not with celebration, but with a simple breath, unburdened the knowledge that he would not have to fold uniforms into duffel bags again, not yet. The apartment remained small, the walls thin, but it was still his ground, still a place where he could begin. 1 week later, Guardian Pines called with news that folded Liam's chest inward. Beatrice had passed in her sleep peaceful, as though having given away her burdens one by one until nothing remained to tether her. The funeral service was hushed and dignified. Elise placed the journal atop the casket before it lowered her whispered words, a farewell, layered with both regret and gratitude. The museum sent a display case for the reception, the sapphire pendant glimmering beneath lights a photograph of Beatrice in her prime, wearing it Richard at her side in uniform. Guests lingered before it in silence, the story of their devotion, palpable even to strangers. Elise held Liam's hand tightly as she whispered, "You carried this story like a Marine." He nodded throat-thick, knowing that his duty had extended far beyond battlefields. Spring crept into Ashbrook with rains that left the sidewalks smelling of wet earth. Liam's apartment filled with cardboard boxes and the rustle of packing tape. Second Light Goods took shape in those cramped rooms, an online shop built late into the nights after shifts at Riverbend Storage, where Hank now let him pick up extra hours helping with auctions. By day he carried boxes. By night he photographed items on a makeshift backdrop, each description typed carefully, each object treated with the respect he had learned through Beatrice's belongings. Customers began to arrive, slowly leaving notes of appreciation for the care in packaging, for the stories attached to even the simplest scarf or pair of gloves. On his wall, he pinned the museum's thank you letter beside a program from one of Beatrice's galas, her name circled in neat handwriting on the seating chart. Above them hung a photograph of himself in uniform before a folded flag, the weight of service still present in the lines of his posture. Meals remained humble bread, spread thin with peanut butter near the end of each month, but the air no longer carried the chill of foreclosure. The last time he visited Unit C-19, it was nearly empty. Only a tarp and a few clear bins remained. He pressed his palm against the cold steel door before lowering it for the final time. "We kept it from being lost," he murmured, a vow completed. Outside, the wind picked up the torn auction banner that had once lured him, sending it snapping and fluttering like a weary flag at rest after battle. Liam stood for a moment, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The Marine in him recognized the silence as both ending and beginning. If you've stayed with Liam's journey until now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which moment struck you the most? His first bid on that forgotten unit, the discovery of Beatrice's journal, or the final choice to honor her wishes? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you'd like to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and share your support.